You may find this an odd nomenclature for this next chapter, but it's called. But I think you realize it's got an awful lot more punch to it than you can imagine. And it's called Our Book of Instructions. Now, we abhor corporal punishment, but to what length can it be used or avoided in a world we live in today? Yes, I grew up with corporal punishment, and I resented it when it was administered by outside influences. And the reason being, these were would-be character assassins, and they would overdo a punishment not being related by blood, making their actions really criminal. Dad had a third-grade education while my mother had a fourth. We grew up seeing and knowing our parents struggle just to communicate with each other. Dad was a coal miner and preferred to keep things simple with no compromise possible. We knew not to test his limits, and then fell upon Mom's parameters as I would test to see how far they would stretch. Mom always tried to remain stoic with me, but I preferred to be wrapped up in my own little world. It was a matter of learning how not to push her buttons that remained the objective. When I finally reached her limits, a quick swat worked just fine. It was a threat of physical retribution from outside the home that became a means of coercion rather than a tool for learning. Although it was Mom who instilled my sense of fair play, it was Dad who was the enforcer of it. The preacher, written around 200 years before Christ, explains it best as follows. Now, because I have such problems pronouncing this, I'm going to spell it out. Ecclesiasticus, chapter 30, verse 1. He that loveth his son frequently chastiseth him, that he may rejoice in his latter end, and not grope after the doors of his neighbors. He that instructeth his son shall be praised in him, and shall glory in him in the midst of them of his household. He that teacheth his son maketh his enemies jealous. In the midst of his friends he shall glory in him. Now, chapter 30, verse 4, his father is dead, and he is as if he were not dead, for he hath left one behind that is like himself. While he lived, he saw and rejoiced in him. And when he died, he was not sorrowful, neither was he confounded before his enemies. Chapter 30, verse 6. For he left behind him a defender of his house against his enemies, and one that will requite kindness to his friends. Now, we must also be reminded corporal punishment was a way of life during the 40s and 50s. It was acceptable then because it was universally instituted. But when it became a tool to correct in a classroom, and I remember it well, it failed miserably because it was a tool of coercion and bullying tactics. This was the line we must draw between parroting and bullying about outside influences. As we continue on in chapter 30, verse 8, a horse not broken becomes stubborn, and a child left to himself will become headstrong. Give thy son his way, and he shall make thee afraid. Play with him, and he shall make thee sorrowful. Laugh not with him, lest thou have sorrow, and at the last thy teeth be set on edge. Chapter 30, verse 11. Give him not liberty, in his youth, and wink not at his devices. Bow down his neck while he is young, and beat his sides while he is a child, lest he grow stubborn and regard thee not, and so be a sorrow of heart. To thee instruct thy son, and labor about him, lest his lewd behavior be an offense to thee. Lastly, chapter 30, verse 14. Better is a poor man who is sound and strong of constitution, than a rich man who is weak and afflicted in evil. Now, there's another part of this that I think you're going to enjoy. Another character assassination is the use of excessive alcohol that will eventually become addictive and a destructive force, making families choose between divorce and learning how to cope with its excess. My dad was an alcoholic long before I was born, but quit when he seen my faltering ability to cope with his excesses. Here is a beautiful compendium dealing with these situations. Chapter 31, verse 30. Challenge not them that love wine, for wine hath destroyed very many. Fire trieth hard iron. So wine drunk to the excess shall rebuke the hearts of the proud. Wine taken with sobriety is equal life to men. If thou drink it moderately, thou shalt be sober. Now chapter 31, verse 33. What is his life who is diminished with wine? What taketh away life? Death. Wine was created from the beginning to make men joyful, not to make them drunk. Wine drunken with moderation is the joy of the soul and the heart. Chapter 31, verse 37. Sober drinking is health to soul and the body. Wine drunken with excess raises quarrels and wrath and many ruins. Wine drunken with excess is bitterness to the soul. Chapter 31, verse 40. The heat of drunkenness is the stumbling block of the full, lessening strength and causing wounds. Now as we go on, there's another portion to this I think you're going to find interesting. Many of us have gone through this, and as awkward teenagers, memories still linger of a time myself had difficulty adjusting to a new neighborhood when my parents decided to move into a home they could call their own. There was no way for them to know just what kind of neighborhood they moved into, as I began to make friends with the more notorious troublemakers. Continuation of Ecclesiasticus, chapter 37, verse 7. Consult not him that layeth a snare for thee, and hide thy counsel from them that envy thee. Every counselor giveth out counsel, but there is one that is a counselor for himself. Beware of a counselor, and know what need he hath, for he will devise to his own mind. Chapter 37, verse 10. Lest he thrust a stake into the ground and say to thee, Thy way is good, and then stand on the other side to see what shall befall thee. There is still much more sage advice to be offered up in Ecclesiasticus. Although not of Solomon's thoughts, it does bring into view new perspective dealing with difficult challenges from the past, present, and future. Because we think we are a nation built upon progressive thought, many still believe our ancient elders were not the visionaries of futuristic designs. Maybe it's time to rethink our own antiquated reasoning.